afternoon. Nice to see you all, in quote marks, see you all here. This class is going to be on the study of nationalism. And of course, the focus is Assyrianism or Assyrian nationalism, its formation, its history, its present status. Today, we will look at a particular theory, mainly Ernest Gellner's, concerning the development of nationalism. And I'd like to make some comments on it in relation to the development of nationalism or Assyrianism among the Assyrian people. But before that, two things. First, on Saturday, the Assyrian Cultural Foundation is going to have a presentation by Mr. Sabro Bangaro, formerly known as Sabri Atman, on the Assyrian genocide, specifically the Ottoman-German connection and the Assyrian genocide. That will take place at 3 p.m. at the Lincolnwood Library from 3 to 4:30 p.m. You have to register. You could register there, but you could look at the Assyrian Facebook the same way that you registered for this class. You should be able to register quickly. For all you need to do is really put your name and your email, and you're all set, I think. Second thing, yesterday we had a very nice presentation by Dr. Jack Donus at Princeton, and he gave a wonderful presentation, a survey of Syriac history. I thought gave a very powerful argument for the role of the churches, specifically the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church, in preserving the language, enhancing it, strengthening it, giving it to us, passing it to us today, over a number of centuries. So during the relevant to us in this class, during the question and answer session, question was asked concerning the term Aramaic, because oftentimes when we hear the word Syriac, we hear the word Aramaic at the same time, or Aramean. And oftentimes this leads to an understanding that, well, the language of Syriac equals Aramaic, equals Aramean identity, equals Aramean ethnicity. Therefore, it's a kind of a cancellation, if you will, of Assyrian identity. And I think this is a misunderstanding of history, and this has been propagated by a number of Western scholars, such as, for example, John Joseph, who was an Assyrian himself, wrote a book, Nestorians and Their Muslim Neighbors. David Wilmhurst, who wrote extensively on the Church of the East, did excellent research on the state of various parishes of the Church of the East, their history, various villages, and so on, but did such a horrible job in understanding Assyrian ethnicity. And so the understanding or misunderstanding of ethnicity or say nationality and nation has real world consequences. And so the question was asked of Professor Donus, Jack Donus, who teaches at Princeton, and the man has incredible knowledge and very, very intelligent, as to where did the word Aramaic or Aramean come from? And sometimes these words are used interchangeably. And so oftentimes we revert back to biblical references. Certainly Aramean nationalists today, or those we call the upholders of this Aramean identity, are always refer to biblical sources rather than archaeological sources. So I'd like to kind of answer in my own way this question, which was raised about Aramaic and Aramean identity. Why is that? Well, there are consequences to disputes about ethnicity, and this goes on from the 1930s in Iraq, for example, up until today. And this is one passage where there's a debate prior to the massacre of Semele, which took place in August, as you know, in 1933. And this is a statement made by Sayyid Chalabi Haji Thabit in the Iraqi parliament in June of 1933, as you can see. And he says he wants to shed light on this term Assyrian. And he says, by no means are these people legitimate. These people who call themselves Assyrian are not Assyrian at all, as you can see. This land, in effect, what he's saying, belongs to us. He says the same question has arisen in Egypt, but really Mosul is Arab. You could tell he's an Arab nationalist. Mosul is Arab before Islam. Not sure what history he's looking at, but he says that, and he also says this group which calls itself Assyrian should be named Diaris. And oftentimes, when we are discussing World War I or the time of Semele, the tribal names for Assyrians are used instead of an ethnic name. And we will discuss this within the context of the formation of nationalism or Assyrianism as well. And these Diaris intermingle, he tells us, with the Assyrians and Chaldeans. This is confirmed by their being bilingual. If, for example, now here's his challenge, if, for example, there's any of them who can decipher the tablets maintained in our museum, Baghdad Museum, if they can do that, he can make us believe that they are descendants of the great Assyria. Otherwise, don't bother us with this. And so Assyrian identity has been challenged. Now, never mind, it's a little ironic for an Ottoman officer or an Ottoman official who probably was placed in Baghdad by Ottomans from a different location in the empire to make this kind of statement, especially at a time when Iraq is being ruled by a king from the Hijaz, not from Iraq at all. But this type of an accusation has been leveled against Assyrians repeatedly, and I would say all the way up until the present by certain authors. Now, part of the problem has been the confusion or misunderstanding of the Aramean identity. So when we talk about Aramean identity, oftentimes, and even Professor Tannous uses the word Aram as if this was a state, one single state that was coherent in terms of its formation, its structure, its state mechanism, and culture, and so on and so forth. And that is not what archaeology discloses to us. So historically, we do not see that. Rather, we see these various states that we call city-states. Early in the formation of Mesopotamia, we had city-states. Prior to the formation, for example, of what we come to know during the Middle Assyrian period as the formation of the Assyrian state. And we are told by an Assyrian king going back to 1100 BC, I have crossed the Euphrates 28 times, twice in 1 year, in pursuit of the Ahlamu Arameans. Now, this term, the use of the term Ahlamu and Arameans, or both, is superimposed on these people from Assyrian sources. In other words, it's not a term that is used by them. In other words, historically, either through textual sources or archaeologically, we don't see it. And in fact, we are told that by various archaeologists, Ackermans and Schwartz, for example, when assessing the significance of Luvian or Aramean states, and notice they are in quotes, in Syria, in geographic Syria, it must be recalled that our information on the ethnic composition of the diverse Iron Age regional states in Syria primarily concerns the rulers. In other words, not the people, the ordinary people. As a result, it is by no means clear what the ethno-linguistic makeup of the majority of the population of these polities was. Certainly, the material culture shows no distinctions between states dominated by Luvians or Arameans. So, where do we get the term autumn for these states, if that's in fact the case? More significantly, Professor Dominic Bonatz tells us that the ruling classes in the so-called Aramean kingdoms, again, the term Aramean is placed in quotes or is referred to as so-called Aramean kingdoms of Syria, never refer to themselves as Arameans. As an ethnic term, Aramean is a foreign construct generated from Assyrian biblical and only a few local sources. Certainly, it is not a self designation. So, just to kind of clear this misunderstanding of, well, there was this Aramean people with a cohesive and a coherent identity and ethnicity, and they eventually, in the words of John Joseph, took over Assyria and they Aramaicized Assyria, and Assyria became Aramean as if the people just overnight switched their ethnicity from Assyrian to Aramean. Not the case. What we do need to remember historically, and we will delve into this in more detail in later classes, is that the Assyrian conquest of these areas forced a type of a structure, the structure of an empire on this area. And we are told by Ariel Bag, an Assyriologist and historian, the Assyrian conquest of the Levant, including northwest Syria, the area that concerns us, was neither linear nor an easy enterprise. The construct of a world empire and to maintain it was not easy, even with the absolute military superiority. World empires cannot be planned and are influenced by many unpredictable factors, both internal and external. In the long term, Assyria's goals were reached. Almost the entire region was brought under Assyrian rule, and raw materials, luxury goods, people, animals continuously flowed into Assyria as tribute or taxes. One thing that Professor Tannuz did make clear was that the word Assyria clearly, from all historical sources, comes from Assyria. In other words, it's simply another reference to the land of Assyria. Notice, by the way, that the word Syria, I maintain this despite some of my friends disagreeing with me, that the word Syria does not exist in the Assyrian language. It is not a self-designation in the Assyrian language. Yes, Suraya exists, absolutely, Suraya exists, but not Surya as a land. It is a foreign construct. And we are told by Mario Fallas, who recently passed away, in some, the people called Arameans, again, he places the word Arameans in quote marks for a reason, because historically we just do not see the formation of this group, especially compared to what we see among Assyrians. The ruling class definitely refers to the people called Assyrians and takes pride in and refers to the Assyrian people vis-a-vis other people in the empire. In some, the people called Arameans all but disappear after a long history going back to the Ahlamu. They are all Assyrians now, but Aramean ethnicity survives in the form of a distinctive language with its attendant cultural contents. So one could think of the modern language, of course, Surya, Suraya, Suryaya, coming from Assyrian, no doubt, not linguistically, etymologically from the word Aramean. That does not make any sense. It's contrary to logic. But we do have people that we call Suraya or Aturaya or Aramaya advocating now a certain understanding of ethnicity that is different than Assyrianism. And among those most prominent is an intelligent young man by the name of Johnny Meso. And we have a great deal of respect, of course, for the ideas of though we disagree, we have a great deal of respect and respect the right of people to refer to themselves a certain way. More than 100 years ago, he tells us Aramean intellectuals dreamed of. Now, when he says Aramean intellectuals, of course, he does not mean that they refer to themselves as that, but he refers to the Assyrian nation, in quote marks, and a new Assyria. This elite formulated the political idea of Assyrianism in 1917 and introduced ways to make both Assyrians and an Assyrian language. The existence of the modern Assyrians, therefore, so Johnny does not recognize the Assyrians at all, therefore, or Assyrian identity, I should say, uh, can be better understood by imagining how the following slogan just as easily could have come from the pen of one of the architects of Assyrian nationalist movement. We have made Assyria, now we have to make Assyrians. So in our class, we will study, of course, in this class, how nationalism forms among various peoples. We don't think that the revival, the understanding, the enhancement, the building up of an ethnicity is something very unique in the history of mankind, because now we have seen it repeatedly. Social scientists and historians have written about it extensively, among them Ernest Gellner. And next week we will discuss Hobsbawm and in reference to ethnicity and class more, and also discuss that within the context of the Assyrians. And of course, there's in some sources, it isn't simply a disagreement. It's very basis is hostility between churches, and this is a comment I don't want to go over in detail with this, but we are told by one bishop that, listen, our history is 5,500 years old of Aramean history and 2,900 years of Syriac history. We don't want to deal with Assyrian history. We have nothing to do with that. So this is a viewpoint. It's a viewpoint. And another question was asked as to the reference of the Syriac language, because we talked about the Syriac language with Professor Tammuz and how the word Chaldean came about. So this understanding, again, of history and the sources point to various Europeans using this word a bit loosely, although not in the way that we understand it today. Certainly not for people associated with the Catholic Church. So early Europeans used the word Chaldee in a way that was biblical. Ur of the Chaldees is in the Old Testament. It's a misnomer, of course. It's anachronistic, of course, but it is there. It is in the Old Testament. And so European writers use this word for Aramaic for reference to Mesopotamia. And when they used it, they did not distinguish between Assyrians and Chaldeans. Assyrian and Chaldean really meant the same thing, and Aramaic and Syriac really meant the language of the people altogether. So sometimes it was referred to as Chaldee. And St. Jerome, who was a theologian and a historian, a priest who wrote in Latin, used this term very clearly, and this term continued to be used. And of course, it is one of the reasons, probably a fundamental reason, why the Church of the East came to be called the Chaldean Church in the West. Now, this word Suraya, for your edification, especially if you were in the class in the lecture yesterday, the word Suraya, according to Simo Parpola, an eminent historian and Assyriologist, comes from the word Ashuraya or Asuraya. No doubt about it. And it is, according to a number of historians that we have talked to, a number of Assyriologists, that today even though this was not accepted in the past by certain writers, namely, for example, John Joseph, and today, even with people like Johnny Meso and the bishop that I referred to, and some others, of course, for, I would say, sometimes Christological reasons, not really ethnic history. There is no doubt today among most historians that the word Suraya comes from Aturaya or Asuraya, that these words have the same etymological root, and that the word Syria, even though geographically today we see it as different to the west of Assyria, that the word Syria comes from the word Assyria. So with that explanation, and if you have any questions, please do ask at the end of the lecture. I want to delve into the study of nationalism, specifically how Ernest Gellner, how one theoretician, one social scientist understands it. What is it about? How did it come about? What can we understand about it? And what does it tell us about the development when we study this phenomenon? What does it tell us about others, for example? So his theory has been characterized as possessing elements of functional and psychological theories. I don't want to get too much into the technicalities here, but I'm just going to tell you that the psychological theory of nationalism, the point of departure for it is to talk about a need to belong to an identity, a larger identity than oneself, essentially. And where previous systems, tribal and so on, are undermined. This is the development of nationalism. I belong to a nation. I do not belong to a tribe. I am not a Diari. I am not a Jilu. I am an Assyrian. One's identification with one's role in a village, for example, becomes undermined when the village undergoes an industrial transformation. So what's happening here is that this tidal wave of modernization and industrialization transforms society, which disrupts traditional ties between inhabitants. So, for example, status, the status of priests, the status of chiefs, the status of all kinds of people, maybe within the family as well, are disrupted. In such a case, people of the changed village or clan or tribe can no longer identify with their roles, which have disappeared, but must find another identity, which is ethnicity or nationality. So think when we discuss these theories of the Assyrian people, and I will always go back to our point of our address here is Assyrian, so we will always go back. The point of departure is going to be the Assyrian people. Modernization and nationalism. In functional theory, nationalism is perceived to be guiding and rapid process of modernization by bringing the various divided factions, tribal, religious, regional, etc., together to build a significant population ready to be mobilized by the state. Nationalism, in other words, exists because it serves a purpose. It has a function. It is transforming the world, and the state needs to transform its people in order to form the state. Remember what Johnny Meso said? They created an Assyria, so they need to create the Assyrians. Gellner begins now. Johnny Meso is not really, or he could be referring to this, but he's making this argument exclusively about Assyrians. In other words, isolating the Assyrians from the phenomena of nationalism throughout the world is not a fair assessment. It is not accurate, and it is not an honest way of understanding the world. Let's put it this way. Gellner begins his theory by postulating that a society has structure and culture. He defines relations concerning the role of a person in society as part of a structure or part of structure, and those governing expressions such as dress, speech, and so on as part of culture. Both culture and structure exist in all societies, but in small and simple societies, and now it's a little bit biased view, simple societies, There is much more developed structure, i.e., individuals are ascribed roles, often conceived in kinship terms, which determine and circumscribe their activities and relationships to others. Fairly little is left to choice and fancy. In other words, in tribal structure or small village structure, the man is, in older societies, hunters, gatherers, something. Everybody has a role. They don't really get to choose their role. They are born into their roles or ascribed their roles by society. Simultaneously, such societies have an extremely developed culture as well, and this tends to symbolize social position in manner, conduct, ritual, dress, and so forth. The priest is expected to behave a certain way. The warrior is expected to behave a certain way. The wife is expected to behave a certain way, so on and so forth. Now, the Assyrians, prior to, one could say, the formation of nationalism, although Johnny Meso speaks of 1917, I would say the formation is much earlier than that, um, were really the main institutions that comprised Assyrians were church, village, tribe, clan, family. Um, this was the structure of all of the Assyrians. When we talk about the Assyrians, we're talking of people from the Torabdin area in what is today southeastern Turkey, all the way east to Lake Urmia and north to Salamis, south to Soldus, and then to, of course, including the Hakkari area, which was the largest compact Assyrian population, and then south into what we call the Nineveh Plain today. All of these comprised of villages, tribes, most prominently tribes were in the Hakkari area, clans, and family. And the tribe is a group of people that share language or dialect, customs, traditions, geographic location. For example, Tiari, which comprised of 75 villages, Baz, which comprised of several villages, Assyrian villages, Diz, Jilu, and so on, Truma. In the Assyrian case, also a hierarchical structure. So there was the status of the Malik, the Reyes, and so on, and the ordinary laity, the priest, the bishop, Shota, as it is referred to in Assyrian, or in some cases, Millat. Millat is a misuse, of course, of the word. Millat oftentimes refers to a religious community during the Ottoman Empire. Clan, a group of related families. In the Assyrian case, for example, the village of Marbishu had 5 main clans: the Qalleta, Khnanishu, Qalleta, that's me, Khnanishu, Mamishu, Qallu, and Kaku. Beta or Ujah, extended family, parents and their children with aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins. Khizmane, Qariwe, Kilpet, in the Assyrian language. Nuclear family, of course, parents and their children. And now with the Assyrians, the clan was a very prominent unit. And of course, larger than that was the tribe, and of course, membership in churches as a very important institution. We see a picture of the Malik in the center, Malik Khammu of Baz. He sits in a diwan, in the traditional horseshoe-shaped gathering of Assyrians. And this picture is taken prior to the departure, the flight, the escape of the Assyrians from the Hakkari Mountains. They are seated in a village in Baz. And this book was produced in Russia, and it has wonderful photographs. So I just wanted to share this with you. So identity, culture, and industrialization. First, the rise of the significance of culture and the need for identity. Second, the role of a novel or unique culture in the formation of nationalism. And third, the impact of industrialization. on the development of nationalism, specifically as it relates to the involvement of intellectuals and proletarians, your ordinary workers. Gellner says there is a causal relationship between erosion of the traditional order of roles. Remember the Malik, picture the Malik sitting there, and here we have another Malik Ismail of Upper Tiari seated um, in the center, and his son Malik Yaqub, who's the author of a book, Assyrians in Two World Wars, is behind him to the right, slightly to the right, as a young man. Malik Ismail was a very prominent Malik in the Hakkari Mountains. So Gellner says there's going to be an erosion of these structures in society by the impact of industrialization. And we're going to talk more about this, of course. And the subsequent increase in the importance of culture, which he defines essentially as the manner in which one communicates in the broadest sense. And communication is very important in the development of nationalism. This heightened relevance of culture, importance of culture in people's lives is linked to the incoherence experienced by individuals in an environment that is changing. Things are changing, and we are going to discuss the importance of the development of nationalism and how Assyrians in Urmia were being transformed and in other places, and why nationalism became a very important factor in their lives. So he tells us individuals in an environment are experiencing incoherence that is changing or has changed. The society has changed under the impact of the wave of industrialization, which disrupts life by disintegrating the traditional ties and roles which people had. So there's a major transformation in society, and nationalism has and culture has a very important relevance, therefore. So culture becomes meaningful. Why does culture become so meaningful to people? Gellner's thesis is contingent on the existence of man's need to understand himself. Everybody needs to understand themselves and their relationship with others, and man's need to belong to a collectivity. We are all part of a community of people. To have a niche in society, either one will have a position, a place in society, or he will seek it in other ways, according to Gellner. If a man is not firmly set in a social niche, whose relationship, as it were, endows him with his identity, he is obliged to carry his identity with him in his whole style of conduct and expression. In other words, culture, quote unquote, becomes his identity. So going again to the point of departure, back to the Assyrians, in Kharput, for example, where a community of Assyrians lived, Euphrates College was established in 1876. The Americans were very active here, where Assyrians and Armenians lived. It was this college that gave rise to some of the Assyrian nationalists, such as Ashur Yusuf. This is where he was educated and later taught. And he tells us to attain cultural development and progress among the Assyrians, both as individuals and as a people, it is necessary to have the highest ideal in life and to seek to realize it. And to reach this goal, families also must bring forth children with a Christian and national character. Now, we must remember that Ashur Yusuf, which was educated with American missionaries, so it was this fact of faith was very important. Denominationalism was less important. And national character, who will serve the nation. And schools must produce leaders. The church and the clergy should revive the pulpit with fiery language and divinely inspired message. Of course, evangelical view there. Extol the life of the soul. And the wheels of the press should grind out newspapers. There's always a great deal of importance placed on the production of literature. especially national literature for the Assyrian people. Recall, if you had been in the class before, the reference made to print capitalism by Benedict Anderson, who wrote Imagined Communities, how important print capitalism was. In fact, in the formation, it's one of the fundamental producers of a nation, this, what he calls imagined community. So, and the wheels of the press should grind out newspapers and books to promote the intellectual, spiritual, and national life of the Assyrians. And he further says, let family, church, school, so this is a rearranging of Assyrian tribal structure, for example, or village structure. Let family, church, school, and press unite in the spirit, cooperate, and render mutual assistance, for it is only then that this nation, which has embarked on the journey to self-enlightenment, will attain the supreme ideal in life, which it must of necessity pursue. Now, Ashur Yusuf was sadly executed in 1915 during the Assyrian genocide, and he wrote quite a bit about his views of nationalism, Assyrianism specifically. And one of the references he makes is he's about to be executed, he's in prison, and he has reportedly written that, do not worry, if I am executed, I will go to protect Assyrians in heaven. I will be their protector in heaven. Now, Assyrians are by no means, of course, as we stated, exclusive in the development of their nationalism or their Assyrianism. Among Arabs, Albert Horani, a classical writer of on Arab history, tells us that Arab Christian intellectuals prior to the turn of the century noted that upon separation from their native community, Western educated young men desired to belong to another community, one that would be recognized by authorities, which they could comprehend as their own. The secular Arab nation was that entity for many. There's a wonderful book written by George Antonios. Arab Christians, of course, played a very important role in the development of Arab nationalism, and part of their goal, part of the function of Arab nationalism for Arab Christians was, of course, to be treated evenly with their Muslim brethren within the larger Arab secular nation. Indeed, the founders of the Ba'ath Party, for example, the early writers on Arab nationalism, the understanding of Arab ethnicity, had all been Christian. Michel Aflaq, of course, should come to mind. And in terms of clinging to roots or desiring to cling to roots, Nehru speaks of Indian intellectuals and middle class. And he tells us they wanted some cultural roots to cling on to, something that would give them assurance of their own worth, something that would reduce the sense of frustration and humiliation that foreign conquest, British conquest, and rule had produced. In every country with a growing nationalism, there is this search, apart from religion, this tendency to go back to the past, to belong to something greater, perhaps, than the present. For Assyrians in Urmia, who left their native church for a number of Western churches, and for whom came the intellectuals who formulated the idea of the Assyrian nation stretching in time from the depths of history to the present time. Now, I'm sure you're going to have questions about this, but this is, not what I'm not saying here is, they didn't just create something out of nothing, of whole cloth. There was obviously something there to begin with, of course, but certainly this revival is a very important part of the formation of Assyrianism. They sought to identify with that entity, with the nation, since they could no longer identify with their church. So there was an abandonment, in effect, or a distancing of oneself from the old structures. And of course, the church was one of them. Tribal structure was another. And here we have a Martuma Odu, again referring to the past. Martuma Odu was the Chaldean bishop of Urmia. He came from Al-Qush, and he tells us, we too, Suraya, Syrians, descend from the Assyrians. We are the children of the Assyrians, or Ashur, biblical reference. We have preserved until today the language of our ancestors. So there's this constant pride, even among the church laity, particularly the educated church hierarchs, such as Martuma Odu, who was, as you probably know, also killed in 1918 during the Assyrian genocide. And a very important source for the building of Assyrianism is Kichwa, the Kichwa newspaper, which is probably, I would say, one of the most foundational voices for Assyrianism that has documented the history and communication of references to the understanding of the nation. And Yohanna Mushi was its editor. And as of 1913, there were a group of people involved with this newspaper, which was published in Urmia in 1906. Freydun Bet Oraham, also known as Freydun Aturaya, was one of them. Benjamin Arsanis was another. And Hakim Baba Parhad was another. Among others, of course, Amir Khas, a gentleman by the last name Amir Khas, and others who took pride in the formation of a new understanding, like Ashur Yusuf, of what it was to be Assyrian. And in the early issue, we are told, and this is very important to understand here and go over, this is the beginning of the newspaper, and it is a statement as to why this newspaper is being published. The primary aspiration of Kichwa is to unite the millet, umta, through love and unity, khubba khuyada, which are the cornerstone of the millet. Today we are not one church. Now you see, there was a transformation within the Assyrian nation, within the Assyrian people, even in the area of Urmia. There were people who became members of the Russian Orthodox Church, people who stayed in the Church of the East, people who became converted to one of the Protestant churches, for example, Presbyterian, so on and so forth. So we are being told we are no longer affiliated with one institution, which we used to be. Changes have come. As we were 70 and 100 years ago, we no longer have nationalistic unifying sentiments. This is looking back with much regret, as it were, understanding the past differently, as if we had those nationalistic sentiments in the past, when in fact we had a church that we all belonged to in the past. Even in spelling and publishing, we are divided. So there's this a very common understanding with nationalists the world over, that there has to be uniformity. We have to even out, we have to kind of break down these simple, different structures within us and form one. Even in spelling and publishing, we are divided. This unusual case is not found in any nation. Not true, of course, but this is what the writers of Kichwa thought. That perceives itself civilized. There are hundreds of such deficiencies that pertain to us Assyrians, we are told. So there's a lot of criticism coming from, as you heard Ashur Yusuf saying, we must do this, we must transform, we must rise to the challenge. The world is changing around us. To unite the nation through letters, communication, increased communication. Essays, there's a social scientist by the name of Karl Deutsch, whose entire theory of nationality and nationalism was based on communication. So we must increase this increase communication through essays, news that find their way to the paper, so constant communication between people. Our people are scattered in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, in other words, Iran, Russia, and America. There are signs that this diaspora will greatly increase. Boy, what prophetic words. And year after year, it will decrease the number of those who still reside in their own homeland. Boy, wasn't that true? This is, remember, being written in over 120 years ago, or close to 120 years ago. Kichwa will strive to be a catalyst for the advancement of education and culture, a forum for the exchange of nationalistic ideas and discussions. Kichwa will not become a device for arousing and strengthening denominationalism. We will not have the place or opportunity for theological arguments. Durashito di Tanai. No room will be provided for the polemics about the greatness of one denomination or faith and the weakness of another. So we don't want to argue about being a part of the Russian Orthodox Church or the Church of the East or Presbyterian Church. We are all from the same flesh and blood and possess one language, we are told. We are one nation. It is our intention to elevate the ethics of our people. Nationalists always speak in this terminology, to elevate and to indoctrinate them into accepting the foundations and pillars that uphold our faith and which we accept without opposition. Now, we will, of course, in more detail, understand the formation of Assyrianism as it came to be represented through various literary works and through various speeches and movements and so on. But when we talk about nationalism, and oftentimes social scientists speak of the formation of a nation regardless of culture and so on and linguistics. It's not about culture, we are told sometimes. Can one cite an example of a nationalism which has no culture, language, or any pre-existing differentiating marks to work on? It is difficult to imagine that Assyrians could be able to develop any sort of a nation without having some kind of basis, cultural traits, religion, language, dress, and so on, to build on. Now, there are examples of states that have or will, over time, forge some collective identity from the various ethnic and religious collectivities that exist within them, force assimilation. Perhaps one can argue the Assyrian Empire long ago did that by promoting a popular festival, inventing traditions, and sponsoring various cultural programs. We will look at Zionism, for example, and the way it has rearranged the history of the Jewish people to make a more nationalistic argument. For example, the reshaping of the history of Masada being one of them. Now, Iraq is definitely also an example to think about. It does not follow, of course, that one who is more culturally and ethnically attuned would make a better nationalist or a nationalist at all. In other words, one who knows how to sing in Assyrian, one who knows how to dance Assyrian dances, eats Assyrian food all the time, speaks the Assyrian language, all of these cultural being involved, does not necessarily follow, according to many social scientists, that that person would be a more nationalistic person. Nationalism, however, draws upon ethnic and cultural themes and symbols to make its appeal on historical glory, language, and a unique and truthful religion sometimes. And we see this with Assyrians, either stressing this or that church. The nobility of tradition, the beauty of the land, and so on and so forth. If these are not present, the collective mind, in the collective mind of the people, they would have to be invented or conjured up. And I gave you a couple of examples there. There are factors which promote public interaction and communication among individuals and are thought to lead to a commonality, a oneness, even if only figuratively among members of society or country. Now, with the Assyrian intellectuals, they evoked memories. And I put that in quote marks for a reason. And we will explain it in other classes that we will have in the future, of a pre-Christian past that transcended the religious, tribal, and factional divisions. We're not Chaldeans, we're not Church of the East, we're not Syriac Orthodox, we're Assyrian. And there's poetry stating exactly that among the Assyrians of the 20th century. The very stress on the use of the name Athuraya or Aturaya, which denotes ancient Assyrians oftentimes, although the word Aturaya and Suraya, Asuraya and Aturaya are the same, or Ashuraya. By the intellectuals of Urmia, and the gradual abandonment of the formerly common term Suraya is a manifestation of this attempt by nationalists such as Freydun Bet Oraham, also known as Freydun Aturaya, Benjamin Ersanis, Martuma Odu, among others, to rally around common symbols of loyalty and abandon sub-loyalties, church, tribe, and so on, and denomination. Nationalistic message was strengthened as Assyrians underwent the sufferings of the First World War, where the collective experiences were bound into national symbols as they related to the very real and impressionable experiences. Nationalistic writings, poems, and folk songs predominated collective Assyrian circles. And this is something that Professor or Dr. David Wilmhurst refers to as literature that is shrill and bombastic on the part of the Assyrians. But this is literature that really expressed the pain and suffering of the Assyrians and sought the solution in the form of the oneness of the Assyrian people, because the divisions within the Assyrian people were perceived to be obstacles to greatness, as expressed by Ashur Yusuf, as expressed by those in Kichwa and other Assyrian nationalists.